Welcome all to the Zateo Town Hall on a Friday afternoon here on the East Coast of the United States. My guest today is Peter Beinart in New York City. I'm in Washington, D.C. We're on the East Coast. I don't know what time zone you're all in, but thank you. I see a lot of you are joining the chat right now. This town hall is one I've been looking forward to for a while, not just because Peter is a good friend of mine, someone whose writing I've admired, but he's got a new book out called Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning. And I got my hands on an early copy of it, and I read it a few weeks ago, and I read it. I was on a plane, Peter. I read the whole thing in one flight. It's that kind of book. And I found myself nodding all the way through the book. I know it's a very provocative, contentious book for some people. I agreed with a lot of it. I don't know if you want that kind of support from me. But,
I do.
I agreed with a lot of it. The book came out on Tuesday. So let me just do the obligatory plug. First of all, go buy the book. You're going to want to buy the book after hearing this conversation, but make sure you buy the book and get out there. It came out this week. Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning. Now, there's a title. As someone who knows how hard it is to come up with titles for book shows, I wonder how you came up with that title, Peter, because you could have titled it, and I just wrote this down to myself, you could have titled it Being Jewish After October the 7th. But you wrote Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning. Why did you make that decision?
Because the organized Jewish community already knows how to be Jewish after October 7th, in the sense that the trauma and the horror of that day, which was one of the worst days of my life, suffuses the organized American Jewish community, the pain that Israelis experienced on October 7th, the continuing pain that Israelis continue to suffer. We're not blind to that. We feel that. And I think everybody should feel that. But what just struck me day after day after day living in the Jewish community was the way in which people spoke as if nothing was happening of consequence in Gaza for Palestinians, right? That the Palestinians who were being killed, and very quickly the number of Palestinians killed drastically eclipsed the number of Israeli Jews killed. Those people were nameless and faceless and generally unmentioned. And if they were mentioned, then you got a series of talking points which generally boil down to either it's not true, they're not really dying, the numbers are fake, or it's their own fault. And that just was something that was very painful for me to hear in a community that, you know, structures my life.
Yeah. And not many people were saying what you were saying back then or in this book. I feel there was a big gap on this subject. And I read the book, and you argue in the book that the dominant story of the Jewish people is focused on persecution and victimhood. And you write that it's time, uncomfortably, for the Jewish people, Jewish communities to write a new story. Right. What is that story?
The story is that we're a group of human beings that have the same capacity to be victims or victimizers as any other group of people. In fact, our sacred texts portray us in this whole range of different roles, and that there's nothing about having been victimized, as Jews were in many, many, many cases, in many horrifying ways, that inoculates you from that, right? And so this effort to suggest that we cannot be oppressors, that a Jewish state cannot be oppressor is a strange way, a way of depicting us as less than fully human, right? Or perhaps suggest that that there's some kind of Jewish exceptionalism, right, that prevents this from being possible. And the way in which the best way to ensure that you do terrible things for any country, for any community, is to think that you are not capable of them. Right? To think that somehow there is something inherent in you. And I argue that there actually is a kind of deviant strain in Jewish thinking that does suggest this, but that the tradition, the elements of Jewish tradition that speak to me most powerfully fundamentally reject the idea that Jews have any inherent holiness or virtue that would lead us to not be able to do the same kind of things that other states, that other peoples do.
So there's already nearly 200 people in the chat. Thank you all for joining on a Friday afternoon or wherever you are in the world. Please stick your questions in the Q&A, not in the chat, in the Q&A box. I will try and ask as many as I can. But I've got loads of my own to ask Peter first. Peter, I got to ask, what are the books behind you on the shelf that you're sitting in front
of? Sorry, this is the Babylonian Talmud. So there are two Talmuds, but the important one was not actually written in the land of Israel. Interestingly enough, it was written in Babylonia. You know, one of the things that I think I've always felt was a kinship with you, Mehdi, is that you and I both have this peculiar status of people who believe in progressive ideals, but also are people who believe in God and try, in my own very flawed way, to live that way. And so there's something called daf yomi, which is a practice in which you read a page of Talmud a day. And if you do that, you finish the Talmud in 7.5 years. Daf yomi means a page a day.
Wow.
So I'm 5 years in. It's actually pretty cool. When they finish it, they rent out Yankee Stadium, basically for all the people who finish the daf yomi cycle. It's mostly like not people who look like me, people with long beards or whatever. But I did it for a lot of reasons. Partly the discipline of it, partly. And what's amazing is the strangeness of Jewish tradition. It's being so intimate to me, and yet also so strange because it was written in such foreign, the recently Sanhedrin, which I'm just studying now, it says that the judges of the Sanhedrin must know all of the languages in the world, and they must know magic. What the fuck did that mean? But it's also that it's Judaism that has not been swallowed by nationalism.
Yes.
Ethno-nationalism.
So let's talk about that. So let's talk about that, because what's interesting is I talk to a lot of anti-Zionist Jews on this show, in journalism, especially post-October 7th. A lot of members of the Jewish community said, not in our name. We don't support Zionism. We don't support Israel. This is why we've always opposed it. Very prominent writers, intellectuals, journalists, authors, media figures. What I find interesting about you is that you've never claimed to be a non-practitioner. As I say, you're sitting in front of the Babylonian Talmud. You just, in your very first answer, you invoke Jewish texts. And it's much harder for people in the organized Jewish community who support Israel, a lot of the Jewish organizations in this country, the AJC, the ADL, AIPAC, it's much harder for them to dismiss you than it is to dismiss a Norman Finkelstein or a Noam Chomsky. Chomsky's never claimed to be a practicing Jew in any way while he criticized Israel. Much harder for them to dismiss you. And then on top of that, you literally write a book saying being Jewish after the destruction of Gaza. You place your faith center stage in your opposition to what's going on in the Middle East right now. Yeah.
Now, to be fair, they seem to do an okay job of dismissing me, but
well, they try. I don't think they do dismiss you. Otherwise, you wouldn't be where you are today.
I mean, look, there's certainly, I have enormous admiration for the people that you've mentioned, and the tradition of secular Judaism. In fact, secular Jewishness. In fact, one of the things that has always haunted me, because as you know, my parents are South Africans, was that the South African Jews who met the moral test of apartheid the best were overwhelmingly communist atheists, whereas the rabbis tended to be basically be complicit. In fact, at the Ravonia trial, when Mandela was sentenced in '64, all the white defendants were Jews, almost all communists. The prosecutor was the president of an Orthodox synagogue in Johannesburg. And so, to me, as an observant Jew, that really haunts me. Why is that? Because it seems to me that Judaism speaks, in many, many voices, just like Islam and Christianity. You can't cherry pick one thing. I'm not going to say that you read the Talmud and you then vote for Bernie Sanders. That's silly, right?
Yes.
But there is something very foundational about the fact that Torah begins with human beings who are not Jews. The story of Abraham does not begin until ways into the book of Genesis. It begins with Abraham. I mean, Adam and Eve and Noah are universal human beings. And the Talmud makes it very clear. This is to say that we all have one creator. Right? It's a very simple and foundational point about universal human dignity.
Is it fair to say that the book, you say in the book, for example, that the book opens with a note to a former friend, and you talk about wanting to convey a message? Is it fair to summarize, for people in the chat who haven't yet bought the book, but they will buy the book, I'm sure, at the end of this, is it fair to summarize and say that really the essence of your book, and why so many of us, I'm not Jewish, but I read a book about being Jewish after Gaza, because it called out to me as a Muslim, it calls out to me as an American, as a human being, is because you are pitching universal human equality against all ethno-nationalism and ethno-supremacy. In your case, it's Jewish supremacy, but it could very well be Islamic supremacy, Christian supremacy, as you say, South African white supremacy. Right. That is the core of the book, making the case for one over the other.
1,000%, right. That it's a very human tendency to become accustomed to supremacy, tribalism, and to believe that equality means death. And also, we see in this moment the way in which great religious traditions are being swallowed by ethno-nationalism. Look at all these white Christians are voting for Trump. Yeah. I thought Christianity was also about the universal dignity of the human being. These people act like if you don't have an American passport, you are worthless, right? Yes. And I'm not an expert on Hinduism, right? Yeah. But I know it's not the same as Hindutva, right? Yeah. And so this is a global phenomenon, and this is our part of it, and it's extremely frightening.
So I promised to everyone in the chat, there's a lot of you. I'm going to come to the Q&A questions, but just one last question from me before I open it up to the viewers. You write, in many Jewish communities, even many Jewish families, suggesting that October the 7th stems from anything but Hamas, from Hamas's pure evil, excuse me, is a ticket to excommunication. Have you been excommunicated? How difficult has it been for you since October the 7th? Even before this book was out, I'm assuming since Tuesday it's been even harder. But since October 7th, how hard has it been?
Well, I am lucky. I am a privilege in a lot of ways. I fit in a lot of other ways in those communities, which makes it easier. And also, I've been in certain spaces for a long time, so people have kind of gotten used to me to some degree. But in other cases, it's been hard. There was someone very close to our family who said, point blank, you know, if you believe that Israel has any responsibility on October 7th, we're never speaking to you again. And they have never spoken to us again. And that's been very hard. It's been very hard. But look, I want to make sure October 7th never happen again.
Yes.
Right?
Same.
In addition to the fact that I don't want all those children in Gaza to die and have their limbs amputated and starve to death. And if your analysis is wrong, right, you're not going to be able to make anything better, right? And so what was it immoral what Hamas did? Of course it was immoral. It's immoral to target civilians no matter what has happened to you. But if you don't recognize you're not willing to talk about what Gaza was like on October 6th, right? Then you can't understand what happened. And what you end up doing is basically just sending the message that Palestinians are barbarians, right? This is what they do because this is their hobby. Right.
My old sparring partner, Elon Levy's been saying for the past few days, as we've seen hostages released, look at this society. This is a broken society, as if Israeli society hasn't also been taken over by traumatized people.
And this is also typical. This is what people said about Native Americans when Native Americans killed men, women, and children on the American plains. It's what you know better than me. It's what people in Britain said about Catholics in Northern Ireland. It's what this is typical, right? Yeah. Instead of seeing people as human beings who are responding, I think in this case, responding in a tragically wrong-headed way, but responding to oppression. And we have to support ways of responding to oppression that are better, that offer an ethical resistance that we can support.
So great to see over 200 of you in the chat on a Friday afternoon. I know we didn't give you that much notice with this one, but let's take some questions. We'll try and zoom through them. Jonathan Wexler says, I like the book, Peter, but isn't it really half a book depicting the unimaginable suffering of the Palestinians without the context of Jewish or world history?
I don't think so. I actually, for instance, I spent a fair amount of time on the beginning of one chapter about 3 particular stories of what happened to Israeli Jews on October 7th. And I also talk about the fact that there are still fewer Jews today who alive today than there were in 1939. This is not alien to me at all. But I think that I'm trying to push back against, I think, a narrative of Jewish history and also a narrative of Jewish texts that I think emphasizes one story to the almost complete exclusion of another. So I start by talking about the book of Esther near the book, right? Yes. Which we read on the Holiday Forum, which is coming up, which we read as a story of Jewish attempted genocide against Jews and Jewish survival. That's an accurate depiction, but it's incomplete because the book ends right with this massacre by Mordecai, the Jewish leader, and his men of another group of people, right? And yet that's so often erased from our story about ourselves.
And of course, you now have the conservative right in America launching Project Esther, which is a campaign to crack down on Palestinian speech. Amy Burke says, I have the book on hold at Barnes & Noble. Good stuff.
Thank you.
Seth Matagi says, where's Seth? Thank you for your words. Do you think October the 7th and the aftermath to it unleashed something new in the region or just accelerated more of the same?
That's a great question. I think, so Israel has this history of expulsion of Palestinians, right? In massive expulsion in 1948, another expulsion in 1967. I think what happened was that Israel had basically given up on the idea of giving Palestinians their basic human rights, either in their own state or within the state of Israel. And there was a process of managing this oppression of Palestinians, managing through the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, and in a strange way, managing with this violent equilibrium, as Tariq Bakoni uses, with Hamas. They thought Hamas was also basically kind of working with them in this strange way. This management system collapsed on October 7th, and the Israeli government is not even willing to. The Biden administration wants a new management system, right? They want to shore up the old management system, bring in the PA, right? But actually, the Israeli government doesn't even really, can't even get behind that, right? So the most coherent view that you have in the Israeli government on its right flank is basically to get the Palestinians out of Gaza, right? If they're not in Gaza, they're not a problem. Or
Which Donald Trump is now on board with.
which he's on board with, right? And this is, to me, the macro question at stake with Palestinians is, can you do in the 19th century to Palestinians what the United States did to Native Americans and what Australia and Canada and many other places did? Is it possible? Many of us, maybe naively, thought that this was not possible in the 21st century. And if it's possible in Gaza, it won't, when Palestinians, it will not stop there, because there are a lot of other leaders in the world that have disposable populations they would like to expel and kill too.
And of course, the Balkans, when we say ethnic cleansing, we think of the Balkans, and that was something that the Western world and much of humanity was opposed to. And in this case, of course, the US is sponsoring the ethnic cleansing. In fact, Donald Trump is claiming it's definitely going to happen. An anonymous questioner says, I live in Scotland. How do I deal with my local Orthodox rabbi, who is a man of God, but makes no mention of the victims of Israel's genocide, but is obsessed with the safety of the hostages and the IDF? Peter, I'm assuming you deal with people like that in your local community all the time.
Yes. I think that the most effective thing that I find in Jewish communities is to try to have people have a human relationship with Palestinians, because we are talking about Palestinians constantly, but never listening to Palestinians, which is a recipe for dehumanization. If synagogues were willing to bring Palestinians in to speak about their experience, so we could start to see ourselves in them, maybe this rabbi is willing to sit down with someone from your town who can just tell them about what their family has been through. I think that can begin a process of change, because I think, and I make the argument, you know, that also that Israeli safety and Palestinian safety are intertwined, right? It just makes very little sense to think that you can expose people to brutal violence and not also create conditions that endanger yourself.
Can I push back a little bit, Peter? Because what you're describing is something I used to push a lot, especially when people talk about Islamophobia. How do you overcome Islamophobia? Well, you know, meet a Muslim, befriend your Muslim neighbor. It's the contact theory, right? The more you come into contact with people, the less you're, you know, surrounded by myths. You see real people. You're away from media depictions.
Yes.
I mean, there's many counter arguments. I just want to throw one at you, which is, what if a Palestinian says to you, Peter, my job is not to come into a synagogue and educate you. Why should I have to go through the pressure? I'm already victimized in many ways. And the burden is not on me to come into a synagogue or into a Jewish community center and say, hey, everyone, I'm human. Please stop support the killing of my people. Like, what would you say to that argument?
I would say if this particular individual Palestinian doesn't want to do that, of course they don't have, no one should.
Others do.
Yes, some other people do, because I think they think it's an effective strategy. And I think it is a strategy, but I have seen it change people.
Okay, here's a provocative question from Nikat Rashid. Please give me an example of an ethical resistance to occupation and genocide where it was resisted by the people and no innocent people suffered as part of that resistance, even in India, where we threw out the British. We had armed resistance as well. Considering the overall management of the Israeli hostages, hasn't Hamas behaved far more ethically than their oppressors?
Well, I didn't say that I thought all resistance has to be nonviolent. I think that I think in terms of international law, which makes a clear distinction between targeting civilians and targeting combatants. If you're in Ukraine and a Russian soldier comes at you, right, you have the right to resist by force. I would point to South Africa. In South Africa, the African National Congress believed in armed resistance. Mandela helped turn it from nonviolent to violent resistance, but it tried, not perfectly, but it tried to maintain a distinction between attacks on military and industrial strikes and civilian soft targets. Other black groups did not as much, but I think the ANC understood beyond some ethical principles that it was just a better strategy. They were involved in a struggle for global opinion, and they knew this would weaken them. And in fact, I've heard that ANC people have actually had conversations with Hamas, going back to the suicide bombings in the 1990s, and said, listen, from our experience, this is a really stupid thing to do, right? I don't think it's been helpful to the Palestinian cause. And also, Mandela was thinking a lot about how he spoke to white South Africans in the language of pressure, but also in the language of giving them a place that they could move. And I don't think something like October 7th does that. It does the reverse.
One thing I've been going on about in media interviews I've been doing when I talk about this subject is the fascinating parallel of Ukraine. You mentioned a Russian soldier Ukraine is happening at the same time as Gaza.
Right.
So you don't
Right.
have to go back to a, Noam Chomsky style, invoke a previous conflict. You have to say, look at Vietnam, look at Iraq, look at World War II. You basically are watching on television, split screen, one conflict where the West says they have a right to resist. You have CNN, I think it was CNN, back at the beginning of the Ukraine conflict. They were filming a group of Ukrainians making Molotov cocktails in a fascinating, almost, heroic way. And I thought, can you imagine if they sat with can you imagine if Clarissa Ward went and sat with a bunch of Palestinians in the West Bank building Molotov cocktails? People would lose their minds back in the US. And that double standard has played out for everyone to see that we support a right of armed resistance in Ukraine, but not in the West Bank or Gaza. Ben Linder asks, Peter, you are ostracized by so many parts of the Jewish community. How do you reconcile your religious beliefs with your political views when so many people conflate the two?
I just try to remind myself that this is in Jewish history, this moment is a blip, right? The state has existed since 1948, right? The books behind me were written over a period of basically between 200 and 500 or 600 CE, right? So we've been doing this. Rabbinic Judaism has been around a really, really, really long time. And I try to remember that whatever you believe about Israel and Zionism, that is not the core of Judaism, right? The core of Judaism are the commandments that we are obligated to try to follow by God, things like Shabbat, keeping kosher, the way we treat fellow human beings, and that we've really, I think, lost sight of that. Because, I mean, you've probably heard me say this again, or you've heard someone say this, Mehdi. How bizarre is it? Hillel International, right? It's the group that works with Jewish college students. If you go to their website, I quote them. They say basically, we don't care if you keep Shabbat. We don't care if you keep kosher. Basically, you could literally have a group say like Jews against God.
But you can't be anti-Zionist. But you can't be anti-Zionist, Hillel.
You can't challenge the state, right?
Which is deeply frustrating because a lot of Palestinian and leftist groups have protested outside Hillel's as a result of that. And they've been accused of anti-Semitism. Unsurprisingly, people who haven't read what you and I have read will say, well, that's not Israel. That's Hillel. That's Jewish campus life. That's anti-Semitic. And it becomes very frustrating because it's hard to unpack this stuff in this heated moment to say, well, actually, Hillel kind of brought it on itself. I hate to use that phrase. Because nobody, like you said, nobody forced them to excommunicate anti-Zionist groups.
Right. I think it's still a bad idea to protest outside of Hillel because it's primarily a religious institution. But you're right. The point I'm going to make in the book is that if we want anti-Zionists, people who don't like Israel, to make a clear distinction between Jews and Israel, which we do, right? Of course, for the same reason we want them to make a distinction between the People's Republic of China and Chinese Americans, then the Jewish community, organized Jewish community, has to make that same distinction.
But they don't want to, Peter. This is what's killing me, right? Since October in particular, I used to think it was accidental, unintentional. It is clearly the case that cynically, not just the Israeli government, but leading American and British Jewish organizations have gone out of their way to make the conflation, right? I spent my life, and you know this, you read my piece 12 years ago in the New Statement, where I talk about anti-Semitism in the Muslim community. I spent my life talking to Muslims saying, please don't conflate Jews with Israel, Jews with Netanyahu, even Jews with Zionists, right? Let's unpack this stuff. And I actually think the pro-Palestine movement right now, with a few exceptions, has done a pretty good job of saying, we're not against Judah, we're against Zionism, we're against Netanyahu. The problem is it's the pro-Israel side that's going around saying, no. If Zionism is part of being Jewish, the chief rabbi in the UK, as you know, has said, Zionism is integral to Judaism. It becomes very hard then to say, hold on, here's me, a non-Jew, telling my fellow non-Jews, hey, guys, don't conflate Jews with Zionists. Meanwhile, the chief rabbi is saying, no, we are, you can't separate us out. It's very
and that's why thank goodness there are a lot of Jews in these movements too, who are living testimony to the fact that the chief rabbi is wrong, right? I mean, first of all, Judaism existed long before Zionism, and there've always been a whole range of Jewish critics of Zionism, and actually the numbers of those people in the United States are actually growing.
The chief rabbi of the UK referred to the Israeli army as our boys, our soldiers, which is literally fuel to the fire for anti-Semites. Because last time I checked, the chief rabbi is British. The only army he should have is the British army. But anyways, Bill Chambers asks on that note about anti-Zionist groups, love your work, he says, what is your opinion of the incredible growth of Jewish Voices for Peace, JVP? Does it indicate a growth of anti-Zionist Jews in the US?
Yes, it does, along with other groups like If Not Now. And there's as Mehdi as you know, there's a big generational divide, especially outside the Orthodox community. And I think we're going to see a whole flourishing of a whole series of new kind of institutions in the Jewish community. Just in New York, There are a number of minyanim, which are like Jewish prayer communities that have popped up in the last year that are basically non or anti-Zionist, almost all exclusively made up of young people, is really quite remarkable. And I think that we're going to see this is going to be a long-term feature of American Jewish life. Not as strong in other Jewish communities, but you see it a little bit there too.
I mean, generation, I keep telling people the gap on Israel and America, both within the Jewish community and across America as a whole,
Absolutely.
is not left, right. It's
Yes.
not Republican, Democrat. It is generational. You just look at the
Absolutely.
opinion polls, age at the top, age at the bottom, complete opposite views.
Right.
Adi Suissa, as a subscriber, says, I'm Jewish. I was raised by both parents as Jewish. I'm not practicing. I'm not a Zionist. How do you feel, Peter, about the Star of David being put on tanks in Gaza?
I feel terrible. I mean, Israel is using all of these symbols, right? It has been since, the flag is designed to look like a talit, a Jewish prayer shawl. It uses the menorah, all of these things. So to me, if you use these symbols in ways that destroy human life, you're desecrating the symbols because, again, Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel said that the human being that is the only thing created in the image of God, right? And that anything, including a state, must be measured by how it treats the human being, right? But unfortunately, that's not the way the state of Israel operates, and it's not the way the organized Jewish community behaves.
There was a recent story about someone I can't remember the details. It was in Canada somewhere. There was a Palestinian cafe where they asked someone to leave because they had the Star of David and they said it's Israeli flag. And then it was seen as an anti-Semitic incident because Star of David is a Jewish symbol. And that, again, it's the conflation.
Yes, 100%.
And I say this as a Muslim, right? When I called out Islamophobia for many years during the war on terror, but I wasn't stupid enough to not understand that groups like ISIS were encouraging that Islamophobia. When you go around and call yourself the Islamic State and then blow stuff up, it is understandable. I'm not defending anti-Muslim bigots, but it's understandable that some people are going to get more Islamophobic when they keep hearing Islam, Islam, Islam invoked. So when the Israeli army and the Israeli military and the Israeli government keeps invoking Judaism and Jewish symbols, I'm not saying that justifies anti-Semitism, just justifies Islamophobia. But it's not crazy that people are going to see those symbols and associate them with genocide and violence, not with one of the world's great religions.
Right. So then the question is, how do you respond? I mean, I have heard, in the young woman at an event I was just at, who basically, a Jewish woman basically said, maybe we have to repudiate some of these symbols. And my argument is, no,
you repudiate the people abusing the symbols. That's what we did in the Muslim community.
Right. We have to reclaim these symbols. These symbols are ancient, deeply important symbols to us in various different ways, the different symbols. And so the point is, use those symbols, right? But in a different way, bring those symbols into a protest and an event for Palestinian freedom. And then in a way, show them that they actually that they can be part of a completely different political discourse.
We have a lot of people. We have 215 people and a lot of questions in the chat. We're not going to get through all of them in the next 10 minutes. We're going to try. Peter Flaherty says, just finished your book today. Excellent. As a non-Jew, I learned a lot about Judaism from reading it. I'd love to pass it on to my Jewish students at the university where I teach. Thank you, Peter. So here's a good one from, where did it go? I just saw it earlier. Oh, Beinart Rubin, who I think is the Beinart Rubin.
Oh, yeah. Hey, Barney, good to see you.
He's one of our subscribers. He came to one of our events.
Great guy.
He says, Carnegie Hall presented Leonard Bernstein's Kaddish on Wednesday night. I was there. I never knew that the text, other than the Kaddish itself, was written by Samuel Pisa, who was Tony Blinken's godfather. And Tony
I didn't know that either.
Introduced the text on stage, and the text was updated, in quote marks, to list other victims of genocide, but with the glaring omission of Palestinians. There were other changes, too, to equate Palestinian resistance to Nazism, is what Beinart Rubin says. I thought of standing up and shouting, Free Palestine, but I didn't have the nerve or terrible bad manners to do it. What should I have done?
Oh, these are really difficult questions, Barney. It's great to hear from you. I try to think in terms of my protests when I'm going to have an impact or not, right? So if when I go to shul, if I get up in the middle and disrupt everything and say Free Palestine, it's not going to convince everyone. It's just going to convince them I'm an asshole, and some of them already think I'm an asshole. So I think one needs to try to kind of think about what the reception of something is going to be, but also different people have different kind of ways of living in the world that make sense for them, and you just have to choose do something to support the struggle for Palestinian liberation that is consistent with who you are.
Laurie Malkoff asks, how hard has it been to break into mainstream media with your point of view? I'm amazed that many talking heads on CNN, MSNBC, other networks seem to avoid this discussion or have been told to avoid it, among the few exceptions being your recent op-ed in the New York Times. You wrote a great piece this week one of my bugbears about does Israel have a right to exist, about this nonsense that states having a right to exist. You made the point that people have a right to exist, not states. Noam Chomsky said years ago, it's a classic Israeli propaganda argument.
Right.
I did a recent debate with Elon Levy last year where you were at. You were in the
I
audience.
was there, yes.
We went to the dinner afterwards,
Yes.
and a slightly drunken man came up to me and started shouting in my face and said, "Does Israel have a right to exist?" And I was like, first of all, I just finished a debate. Can I eat? And second of all, I was like, well, show me the borders of Israel, and then we'll talk about where it even exists. But this idea of right to exist, and you make a great point in your column. I just want to remind everyone that if the UK broke up tomorrow, if Scotland seceded, which it tried to do 8-9 years ago or longer, that wouldn't be the end of the world for the British people. It'd just be renamed and reorganized. The UK does not have a right to exist.
Right, and they would have the right to do that because states should be based on the consent of the governed, which Israel is not, because most of the Palestinians under Israeli control aren't citizens.
But no one makes those arguments. You're one of the few who does. Deal with Laurie's question. I'm going to say that the bit of it. I'm going to add an extra point, which is I would argue Peter cheated a bit, right? Because when you got into the mainstream media, you
That's true. That helped. That helped.
So you were once very pro-Israel.
Yes.
We've talked before. You supported the Iraq War. You were very hawkish 20 years ago. You've changed over the time, but you haven't been excommunicated by the media in that time, thankfully. Touch lots of wood.
I mean, no, I think you're right. That certainly helps. I also think it helps that my name is Peter Beinart and not Mehdi Hasan. I mean, the truth is that this is one of the peculiar roles that I'm in, because the media is more open to having a Jewish critic of Israel like me generally than it is to having a Palestinian, right? Which is a problem. So in a way, the problem with my role is that I can end up being the person who gets the platform when really we need more Palestinian voices, right? And so part of what I try to do in these media environments, to the degree that I can, is say, okay, thank you. I appreciate that you're putting me on, that you're publishing me, but here are some people that you really should be reaching out to, you know? And because I think that's what we desperately need.
Yes, 100%. Michael Y. says, in Missouri, as in other states, there's an attempt to pass a bill to codify the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism in public schools, in high school and university. Very controversial definition, as we know. Supporting this anti-free speech measure, which says things, just for context, like if you say Israel's a racist endeavor, that could be called anti-Semitic, is the main position. Supporting this measure is the main position of most mainstream American Jewish groups, Michael says. Do the leaders of these institutions, Peter, understand that their support for this genocidal regime overseas has turned the Jewish community here, as represented by these groups, pro-fascist, anti-liberal groups, people who used to see themselves, maybe still do, as liberals?
Yeah, I mean, you can look. I mean, the IHR definition, it's so embarrassing, right? Because
Harvard, by the way, is introducing it this week.
The people who study anti-Semitism at Harvard, the scholars of anti-Semitism, think the IHRA is a joke.
Yeah.
I mean, like, you know,
the author of the definition says, I never did it to be a legal measure.
Right. No, and it's basically pushed by a bunch of organizational hacks who want to do it because they want to shut down and delegitimize Palestinian speech. It's incredibly depressing. And yeah, you can't be, you know, what ends up happening is these organizations end up supporting, you know, defending Elon Musk, because they are if you define yourself primarily as an Israel defense organization, which is now what mainstream American Jewish groups, many of them do, your best allies are going to be on the white nationalist right, because they love Israel, because they see Israel as a model for their own countries. And so you end up with a situation where you say that Rashida Tlaib is a bigot because she supports equality between Israelis and Palestinians, but Elon Musk, who's never met a neo-Nazi he didn't like, that he's not an anti-Semite.
How disappointed were you when you saw Jonathan Greenblatt and the ADL come out to defend the salute?
You know, it was horrifying, but you know, again, there's so much. There's such an orgy of cowardice happening in so many institutions that it just takes my breath away. The ADL is just one of a number of them, Jewish and non-Jewish.
Andrea King asks a great question. Do you have any suggestions for books or resources for elementary school children on the conflict, on Judaism, on Palestine?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. I'm not sure that anything immediately comes to mind, but let me come back and maybe I'll email Mehdi something.
Okay, we'll come back for that. Here's a great question from Seth Matagi. Do you think Trump, despite his pro-Israel bias, forced peace in Gaza? If so, why? Because there's this debate, Peter, and Palestinians are having it. I'm sure Jewish Americans, Israelis having it. Did the ceasefire deal, if we can even call it that, let's see if we ever get to phase 2. I'm of the view we won't. If this pause is a better word to use for it, for the inauguration. Was that Steve Witkoff, his real estate guy who he made the envoy? Was that, as the Israeli press reported through leaks, was that him going and saying to Netanyahu, you better effing do this right now and get us a deal? Or was this Netanyahu going, nudge, nudge, make it look like you're forcing me, but really, we're all on the same page, and I told Donald in Mar-a-Lago last year, I'll get him this for the inauguration. Where do you stand in that debate?
It's a really good question. My guess is that it's probably some of both. Netanyahu wanting to ingratiate himself with Trump, Trump wanting to have, Trump likes the idea that he makes the world's best deals. He doesn't care what's in the deals, but he likes the idea that his deals make him look good. But the idea, I agree with you. I don't think this is going to hold after the 6 weeks. I pray that it does, but I don't think it will. And we see that I don't think Trump is going. I think Trump is going to basically support Israel in pretty much whatever it wants to do to Palestinians. I don't think Trump wants to get American soldiers involved in conflict, but I don't think he really cares what Israel does to the Palestinians.
Margaret Holland asks, I'm in Dublin, Ireland. Our president has been called anti-Semitic for mentioning Gaza while giving the keynote address at the Holocaust Memorial on 27th January. What is the point of a Holocaust Memorial if not to warn of it happening again?
Absolutely. I'm going to Ireland is always a place I've wanted to go, and I'm looking for actually places to speak there when I go.
The Irish will welcome you.
I'm very excited to go to Ireland for a lot of reasons. But I think, yes, I mean, let's say something like very childlike simplicity. Why was the Holocaust wrong, right? It was wrong because Jews are human beings, right? Not because Jews are special or different than anybody. It was wrong because of human beings. It would have been equally wrong if it had been done to people from, Mongolia, right? So because all human beings have infinite value. That's what Jewish tradition says, right? So therefore, the lesson of the Holocaust must be that there must never be genocide and inhumanity against any group of human beings, right? And yet you have something like the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. They use the word Holocaust, basically being used to protect a state that's whose own human rights abuses say it's human rights organizations say it's committing apartheid.
The funny thing about the IHRA, I always forget, you should remind, Holocaust is part of the definition name, is how many Israeli politicians would fail the definition of the IHRA. Multiple prominent Israelis have compared what they've done in Gaza to Nazism and Nazi Germany, have compared their leaders. I believe David Ben-Gurion used to call Begin a Nazi.
Right.
So they would all fail definition.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Let me wrap with one question from me. Thank you all for your questions in the comments. Sorry we couldn't get through all of them. A huge audience today. Appreciate you all. The book is called Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning. I assume, Peter, you have two audiences for this book. You have the Jewish audience. As you were writing it, you had two audiences in mind. The Jewish audience and the non-Jewish audience. Yeah. What do you hope both audiences will take away in their own ways from this book?
I think from the Jewish audience, I hope that we can try to challenge the moral catastrophe that has happened in which this inhumanity is being done in our name, and think about how Judaism was swallowed by ethno-nationalism in ways that I think have led us to a position where we treat a state as a god, which our own tradition says always leads to barbarism. If you worship states, terrible things happen. For non-Jews, I would say, think about how you can be part of this movement for Palestinian liberation. And I want to convince people outside the Jewish community, too, to think about a struggle for Palestinian liberation as a struggle for Jewish liberation, because I think we can see that people who, maybe not at the time, but people in retrospect, when they look back at oppression, actually can see that they're no longer being oppressors is a form of liberation for them.
Well said. Powerful. Peter, I wish we could continue this conversation all afternoon and all evening into the weekend, but we can't. Thank you so much. I think we all learned a lot, including myself. I'm speaking on behalf of our subscribers. That was a great conversation. I'm sure we're going to hear from them. Thank you all for joining us wherever you are in the world on this Friday. Go out and buy the book, Being Jewish After the Destruction of Gaza, A Reckoning. Support Peter's work. And Peter, we hope you'll come back soon.
I would love to.
Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.
Take care. Thank you.
Did you like this video? Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel and turn on notifications. For exclusive content and to support our independent, unfiltered journalism, head over to zeteo.com. Your support matters.